This is the PWNAGE Trinity, one of the most highly anticipated releases of 2025, as this is PWNAGE's first symmetrical release in several years, and one that's poised to significantly shake up the ultralight mouse market. The Trinity also marks the first carbon fiber mouse released from PWNAGE, which is exciting, but considering the QC woes we've seen on their previous magnesium mice, and considering that carbon fiber is a much trickier material to work with, my excitement for the Trinity comes with a fair dose of skepticism, as while PWNAGE's mice have always performed amazingly due to their adjustable sensor tech, they've always had some QC or design flaw that hampers their overall usage. But at least on paper, the Trinity appears to be a direct upgrade from PWNAGE's previous mice in many ways, but the most important question in my mind is whether PWNAGE has managed to avoid the many pitfalls of their previous designs while also using a new material. But we're going to answer that question and talk in depth all about the Trinity's pros and cons in today's episode of the mel0n Review. But before we get into it, a quick disclaimer: I was lucky enough to be part of the dev team for the Trinity along with some other community members, but we only had input on things like colorways and what switches would be used for the main buttons. We never received any test units prior to production. So my Trinity here isn't a review unit, so to speak, as this is just a unit all testers receive for free for being part of the dev team. But as always, regardless of the nature of the unit I receive or an affiliation with a brand, I will always be unbiased in my opinions on a product, as you will see clearly later in this video. And lastly, if you enjoyed the review and want to see more videos like this, including a full teardown of the PWNAGE Trinity, be sure to get subscribed and leave a like on this video. But without further ado, let's get right into today's episode of the mel0n Review. In terms of testing parameters, as usual, I used the Trinity for roughly 3 weeks, daily driving the mouse for both work and gaming, and over my testing period I used both hard pads and fabric pads. For skates used over testing, I used the Trinity stock skates for a couple days and then I swapped off to the included dot skates, both of which performed fine, but I opted to use aftermarket skates for the rest of my testing as they were better suited for some of the pad types I used over my testing period. And for sensitivity, I used my normal range of 40cm per 360 for soft pads and 50cm per 360 for hard pads. For pricing, the Trinity retails for $139.99 USD, a surprisingly low price compared to the other carbon fiber mice that are available on the market. For colorways, the mouse is available in the standard black and silver colorways, and it is also available in 3 limited edition colorways: the Nacho, the Sakura Samurai, and Midnight Eclipse versions. But one thing I'm very happy to see is that the Trinity is available both in cut sides, similar to the sides of the PWNAGE Stormbreaker, and solid sides. PWNAGE's mice not having solid sides has been a long time issue area with their previous releases, and I'm very happy to see that they're finally offering solid sides, and hopefully we'll see this option continue to be available on PWNAGE's future releases, as the solid sides feel much better than the cut sides. Alright, now in terms of in-game performance, as we've seen with PWNAGE's previous mice, they've always performed exceptionally well, but they've always had some kind of QC or design issue that hamper their overall experience. And even though the Trinity is quite different from PWNAGE's past releases, it sadly falls into the same pattern, as while it performs great, my unit had several QC and design issues. Now before I talk about those issues, let's talk about the good first. The mouse's shape is great. It is a little small for my hands, but my hands are very large, so this is to be expected, but the shape is very well designed in my opinion, and unlike PWNAGE's previous mice, the Trinity's frame is covered with an actual coating, which is a significant improvement over the raw, slippery magnesium shells we saw in the Stormbreaker lineups. The Trinity also has the same adjustable sensor we saw in the Stormbreakers, which I'm very happy to see, as this gives this mouse that same flexible performance that I adored on the Stormbreakers, but we'll talk more about this later. And just like the BLG Stormbreaker, the Trinity also supports 8K polling on both wired and wireless connectivity types, which is a fantastic thing to see. Some of PWNAGE's older releases were capped to 1kHz on wired, which is always a little disappointing, and I'm very happy to see that we have full 8K on the wired connectivity here on the Trinity. And just like we've seen on PWNAGE's previous mice, the high polling rates on both connectivity types are extremely well implemented, which is great to see, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. Alright, now with the good out of the way, let's talk about the bad. Firstly, my unit has a lot of creaking and flexing, and the base on my Trinity is extremely thin. So thin in fact that it doesn't provide much structural support to the sides of the shell, so whenever you grip the mouse there is a significant degree of creaking and flexing, especially on my unit and even with the solid sides. My unit's left click also had a lighter actuation weight than the right click out of the box, which turned out to be a factory error as the left click's anchoring screw wasn't fully tensioned. But once fixed, both the main clicks do feel pretty good. I initially did also have an issue with my unit double clicking, but a firmware update resolved this issue. My Trinity's side buttons also had some pretty serious issues, issues, as out of the box they also had uneven actuation weights, same as the main clicks, but this time the issue was caused by the side button PCB itself not being anchored correctly, and also that the framing that holds the PCB in place wasn't the greatest and was quite thin, which caused the PCB to shift and move over my testing. Thankfully, I was able to fix this as well, and once the PCB was properly anchored, which did take a couple tries because the anchoring mechanism is quite bad in all honesty, the side buttons did feel better, but they're still not great. But on the plus side, their actuation weight has been significantly reduced coming from the clunky, heavy Stormbreaker side buttons, but even with the lighter actuation weight, the Trinity side buttons didn't feel the best, and we'll talk more about why that is later in this video. I did have some other nitpicks about the mouse, which we'll talk more about later in this video. Admittedly, a lot of them are fairly minimal, but things I still wanted to mention, and once I did fix the main clicks and the side buttons, the Trinity did impress me as it performed amazingly, and of course the adjustable sensor gives the Trinity that flexible performance you'll only find on PWNAGE mice, just in a smaller, more accessible form factor compared to PWNAGE's previous releases like the Stormbreakers. But overall, just as I've seen with PWNAGE's previous mice, while the Trinity performed great, my unit's usage experience was marred by several QC and design issues, many of which we've seen on PWNAGE's past mice, which is extremely disappointing to see. In terms of unboxing and accessories, the Trinity comes in a more traditional style box than the pizza box style packaging that was used for the Stormbreakers, and the Trinity's packaging has a nice tactile texturing to it with some nice minimal branding across it. Inside we have the mouse itself, this is the Nacho colorway, along with the traditional pyramid shaped 2.4 GHz dongle, which also has the same theming as the mouse itself, which is a nice touch. The mouse itself comes with full-size PTFE skates pre-installed, and the skates do have the same blue protective film over them that we saw the previous PWNAGE mice, so be sure to remove this film before you use the mouse, as these will cause the skates to feel very slow if not removed. The mouse also includes a pretty comprehensive accessory package, which includes a USB A to C cable, which is thicker than the one we saw included with the BLG Stormbreaker, but it's still quite flexible, and the paracord wrapping is pretty low friction, which is great to see. But sadly, the USB-C end on this cable still isn't tilted, which is quite disappointing to see considering the Trinity's support for up to 8 GHz over its wire connectivity. We also have an extra set of full-size PTFE stock skates and a set of 40 PTFE dot skates. Both of these skates have the same blue protective film over them as the pre-installed stock skates, so again, make sure you remove this film before you use the skates. Also included, we have a tiny screwdriver, the same type that was included with the Stormbreakers, which has both a Phillips and a flathead ends, and you can use this not only to adjust the mouse's sensor position, you can also use it to disassemble the mouse or as a tool to remove the mouse's stock skates. Personally speaking, I've always loved that PWNAGE mice include this little screwdriver, and I'm very happy to see it included here with the Trinity. Another thing I'm very happy to see return here is the fantastic included grip tapes, and just like the BLG Stormbreaker, the Trinity includes both a full-size pre-cut set and a small universal set of grips, both of which perform amazingly, and we'll talk more in detail about these later. Lastly, we have a holographic PWNAGE sticker and a full paper user manual, but this user manual is printed in English only. I assume other regions will receive manuals printed in their respective languages, or the mouse will include a full multi-language user manual, but regardless, I'm happy to see a paper manual included nonetheless. And in terms of warranty coverage, the Trinity does come with a standard 1-year warranty provided by PWNAGE. But overall, just like the BLG Stormbreaker, the Trinity's unboxing experience and included accessories is fantastic, the second best on the market currently, and only being trumped by G-Wolves in my opinion. In terms of build quality, firstly, the mouse's upper housing is actually quite well built with no noticeable issues, but the base, as I mentioned earlier, is quite the issue area as it's incredibly thin and bends or flexes whenever pressure is applied directly to it or its sides. This is what's causing the aforementioned creaking and flexing on the mouse's sides, as the base isn't providing enough structural support for the mouse's frame. I also had some concerns about the base's flexing affecting the sensor positioning, but over my testing I didn't run into any issues, but I would avoid putting any skates anywhere near the sensor, as they could cause the sensor to tilt and not track properly due to the thinness of the base. But despite its thinness, I will say the base does sit completely flat out of the box, which is a great thing to see. And in terms of QC, as I mentioned earlier, both my main clicks and side buttons had issues out of the box, where the left main click wasn't anchored properly and out of the box had an uneven actuation weight compared to the right main click, and both the side buttons had uneven actuation weights due to the PCB's interesting anchoring. Now, to talk about this more briefly, Unlike the Stormbreaker's side button PCB, which was braced on both sides, for whatever reason the Trinity side button PCB is only braced on one side, and the right side of the PCB is just slotted into this U-shaped holder. So if the factory doesn't properly install this PCB or under or over tensions the top anchoring screw here, the PCB will be anchored incorrectly, causing the side buttons to have uneven actuation weights or does not work at all in some cases. Now thankfully, both of these QC issues were relatively easy to fix, as the Trinity is thankfully a very easy to service unit, but QC and design issues like this are absolutely unacceptable on a retail unit. Another minimal nitpick I wanted to mention yet again is that PWNAGE has still not blacked out the battery cables on the inside of the mouse, which is really disappointing. I've been pointing this out since I covered the Stormbreaker V1, and it's really sad to see these cables still not be wrapped or blacked out, as these cables stand out like a sore thumb through the mouse's open top shell. Now circling back to my discussion about build quality, in my opinion it appears as if PWNAGE has fallen into the same rabbit hole that many other brands have fallen into when developing an ultralight mouse, as it's very apparent they've sacrificed several structural aspects of the Trinity's build quality to achieve the Trinity's ultralight weight, quote unquote. Personally speaking, I would have much rather seen a heavier Trinity with a firmer base shell similar to the ones we saw in the Stormbreakers, as this would prevent the sides of the shell from creaking and flexing so much, as well as make the sensor's housing much more rigid, and with a little more weight to work with, they also could have improved the side button PCB anchoring to make it more akin to the one we saw in the Stormbreakers, as those held the PCBs in perfectly and I never had issues with them shifting or causing any button interference, as opposed to the ones here on the Trinity, which is finicky to say the least. As I mentioned earlier, PWNAGE was definitely chasing an ultralight weight when they designed the Trinity, and they did achieve their goal at the cost of some structural aspects of the mouse of course, but the Trinity does weigh in at an impressive 37 to 39 gram weight, and this gram weight applies to both the solid-sided and cut versions of the Trinity. Now my unit, being the solid-sided version in its stock configuration with its stock skates, weighs a surprising 41.3 grams, a weight that's far outside the advertised weight spec. Now longtime viewers of the channel will know I have a strong distaste for inaccurate weight specs, and I definitely think that PWNAGE needs to update their marketing, as this mouse does not weigh anywhere between 37 to 39 grams. But regardless of the inaccuracies, the mouse's weight is honestly quite good for the size, but I do question if all the sacrifices that were made to the mouse's build quality were worth it considering its true weight, as mice like the Pulsar Crazy Light are within the same true weight spec, but have much better overall build and feel to them compared to the Trinity. And because of this, as I said earlier, I would have much rather seen the Trinity weigh more around the 45 plus minus 2 gram weight range and have a much sturdier build with no sacrifices made to the internal design than the current ultralight iteration of the Trinity with its many design issues. And in terms of balancing, since the Trinity has an adjustable sensor, PWNAGE couldn't balance the mouse for all the possible sensor positions, so they opted to balance the unit centrally, right at the deepest part of the mouse's hourglass-shaped side profile. Now this does mean that the Trinity won't be exactly balanced for all the various sensor positions, being less balanced the further the sensor goes from its stock position, but this is a fairly minimal issue, as it'd be almost impossible to balance the mouse for every possible position. But one potential way to address this on not just the Trinity but all of PWNAGE's mice would be to add some kind of weight to the sensor PCB, which would physically move with the sensor to help balance the mouse to the mouse's actual sensor position, not the mouse's frame's natural balancing point. Of course you could mod this in yourself, as the Trinity is very easy to open and service, but this would be a cool feature to see stock on PWNAGE's future mice to allow proper balancing to match the position of the adjustable sensor. As I said earlier, I absolutely love the adjustable sensors here, as I've utilized them on every single PWNAGE mouse I've covered to date, and I'm really happy to see this feature here on the Trinity, as it makes this mouse and of course the other PWNAGE mice perform in a league of their own. Now adjustable sensors have a lot of benefits, far too many to cover in one video, but its biggest benefit is that you can adjust the sensor's position to your grip style and hand size. For example, with my larger hands, the sensor in its stock position sits much lower since I grip the mouse so high up, and due to the low position, the mouse feels quite slow. But because the sensor is adjustable, I can counteract this by raising the sensor's position so it sits higher in the shell, allowing for a more natural feeling when using the Trinity. But even if you have a more normally sized hand, you can raise the sensor position to make the mouse feel faster, as higher sensor positions will give a higher range of motion, or you can lower it to shrink the range of motion to make the mouse feel slower and more controlled. But keep in mind, it will take time to adjust your aim to any non-stock sensor position, so So if you experiment with the Trinity's adjustable sensor, be sure to give yourself a couple days for your aim to adjust to it. But I do highly recommend playing around with the adjustable sensor, as it allows for so much flexibility in terms of performance and feel of the Trinity, and it makes the mouse and of course PWNAGE's other mice perform in a league of their own, as I mentioned earlier. But while this adjustable sensor is an amazing feature, there are some ways where it could be improved. Firstly, as I said when I reviewed the BLG Stormbreaker, while I'm glad they added a numerical guide to the adjustable sensor, they should add some way to properly return the mouse to its stock position, as currently it's very difficult to exactly recenter it. This could be easily resolved by adding a white circle the same diameter as the screw in the sensor's slider rail, so you can position the screw over it to be precisely recentered and not have to do it by eye, as it's always going to be off by a little bit. And secondly, since the Trinity's base shell is so thin, it's very easy to warp or imprint the adjustable sensor's screws into the base shell if they're over tightened, and if the screws are over tensioned, there's also the possibility of the thin base warping. So it would be nice to see the base be thicker so it's not so easy to damage the base with the sensor's screws, and of course a thicker base would also help with the creaking issues, as well as making sure the sensor's housing doesn't warp or tilt depending if there's pressure applied to its base from a mouse pad or a skate. Now, in terms of shape, the Trinity is obviously a very different shape from PWNAGE's previous releases, but this isn't a new shape for PWNAGE, as the Trinity is a reimagining of PWNAGE's old Ultra Custom Wireless Sim 2 shape, just with updated specs and a new material. You can also compare the Trinity shape to the Razer Viper Mini or the Hitscan Hyperlight, as the shapes are similar with some slight differences between them. Now, unsurprisingly, the Trinity is a symmetrical mouse which is right hand optimized. You can use the mouse if you're left-handed, you just won't have access to side buttons. And in terms of dimensions, the Trinity measures 118mm long. For height, at the peak of the hump, the mouse measures 39mm tall, and this gradually declines with the shell's curvature to around 14mm tall towards the front of the mouse and 8.9mm at the rear. And for widths, at the top of the shell, the Trinity measures 56.7mm wide. At the middle, where this hourglass-like shape terminates, it measures 54.4mm wide, and on the Trinity's rounded rear shell profile here, at its widest point, it measures 60mm wide. And in terms of shell profiles here for the Trinity, looking at the mouse top down, we can see the fairly standard symmetrical shape, but it has a much more exaggerated hourglass-like curvature to its sides than you'll find on many similarly shaped symmetrical mice. Flipping the mouse over and looking at it from the base, the more exaggerated hourglass shape of the shell is much more visible, and we can see that the forward middle part of the shell is offset from the base frame slightly, and we can also see the very exaggerated rounded rear shell profile. From the sides, we can see the top shell's hump profile, which terminates slightly behind the mouse's midline, quote-unquote, terminating roughly at the middle point of the rear side button. We can also see that, as per usual for a symmetrical mouse, that the forward shell curvature has a much more gradual decline to it, while the rear shell's curvature is much more aggressive. And looking at the Trinity from the front, we can again see that gradual forward shell curvature we just mentioned, but we can also see that the mouse's sides are quite rounded at the front, but they gradually flatten out towards the middle of the mouse's sides. But as you move further down the mouse's sides, since the top shell is wider than the base, the sides of the mouse are quite inwardly tilted, specifically from the top to the middle point of the mouse, which may make anchoring your fingers on the side of the mouse a little difficult if you have very slippery hands. And lastly, looking at the Trinity from the rear, we can see the mouse's aforementioned rounded rear region, and we can best see the mouse's top shell profile, which is a taller, slightly rounded shape. Now, in terms of contact areas, as I mentioned earlier, since I have such large hands, the Trinity was a little on the small side for me, still usable though, but definitely on the small side. Now, with my 1905 by 12.7 centimeter hands, I'm able to use a tilted claw grip here on the Trinity, and my primary contact areas are my mid to low thenar, mid, upper, mid palm, and upper hypothenar region. For finger contact, my thumb rests on the upper sides of the mouse slightly above where the hourglass shape terminates, while my index and middle finger rest on the upper ends of the main clicks, and my ring and pinky finger rest around the middle region of the shell's right side, slightly forward of the hourglass-like shell profile's termination point. Now, while the Trinity is on the smaller side for my hand size, for other hand sizes, the Trinity is going to be quite versatile in terms of its hand size and grip compatibility. For smaller hands, roughly measuring 11.7 by 7.5 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for palm and claw grips. For small to medium hands measuring 13.5 by 9 centimeters, the mouse will again be best suited for palm and claw grips. For medium-sized hands measuring approximately 15 by 10 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. For medium into large hands measuring approximately 16 by 11 centimeters, the mouse again will be best suited for claw and fingertip grips. For large hands measuring around 17 by 12 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for primarily fingertip grip, but you might be able to claw grip it depending on your hand size. And for extra large hands like mine measuring approximately 19 by 13 centimeters, the mouse will be best suited for fingertip grips only. As I mentioned earlier, one of the biggest improvements to the Trinity is that the shell has an actual coating applied to it, unlike the previous PWNAGE mice such as the Stormbreakers, which always had slippery raw magnesium shells. Now the Trinity's coating as described by PWNAGE is a matte coating, but it feels quite different from the other matte coatings we've seen on other mice, but regardless it's decently grippy. I'd best classify the coating as average in terms of performance, as it's slippier than the more chalky or rubberized coatings we've seen on Endgame Gear, Razor, Wise Owl, or Pulsar mice, but it's grippy enough for most hand types to maintain a decent level of gripability on the Trinity. But if you have very sweaty hands as I do, the coating will probably feel a little slippery and you'll probably need to use the Trinity's included grips to consistently hold the mouse. Now in terms of the included grip tapes, as I mentioned earlier, the Trinity includes the same fantastic grips we saw included with the BLG Stormbreaker, and the grips come in two forms, a full-size pre-cut set and a small universal set, so you can place the grip tape essentially anywhere you want on the Trinity shell, which is a great attention to detail. Now the included grip tape reminds me the most of the X-Ray Pad Cicada Wing 2.0 grips, as they have a similar thickness and the same skin-like flattened texturing to them, and the grips have roughly the same level of stickiness, so they're quite sticky to the hand and very easy to grip, and they're actually so sticky I can actually lift the entire Trinity just with 2 fingers on 2 pieces of the grip tape, which is quite impressive. But one downside to these included grips is that due to their thinness, if you place the grips anywhere on the shell that's not solid and has this cut hole-like texture in it, the grip's texture will change to match the non-solid areas of the shell. Another downside to the grip's thinness is that they're not very reusable, as the grips will tear or warp when removed from the mouse's shell, but admittedly this is common for all thinner grip tapes like this, but it's something to keep in mind if you want to move the grips or change their position over time. But overall, just like the grips included with the BLG Stormbreaker, the Trinity's grips are fantastic, and even though the Trinity has a pretty decent coating, if you have sweaty hands like myself, these grips make the mouse significantly easier to grip, which is a wonderful thing to see, and hopeful to see these same grips included in PWNAGE's future mice. Now, the Trinity's main clicks are very reminiscent of the main clicks we've seen PWNAGE use on their previous mice such as the Stormbreakers, but due to the different shape, there are some notable changes to them. Firstly, since the mouse is a symmetrical mouse, not an ergo mouse, the shape of the main clicks is much more standardized, being flatter, slightly tilted shell buttons. It's also worth noting that the click height is much shorter than it was on the Stormbreakers, measuring approximately 14mm at the end of the clicks and around 38mm at the top. Now, the shell buttons themselves have the same etched patterning PWNAGE used on the Stormbreaker's main buttons, of course with a slightly different design, but I'm actually quite happy to see this return, as the design not only looks great, it does provide a little bit of extra texture to grip on these main clicks. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the buttons are semi-flat, slightly tilted buttons that do have a deep groove running through the end of the main buttons to around the middle region of them, and this groove helps to guide your fingers toward the center of the shell buttons, which is a great attention to detail, and since the shell buttons have the same matte coating as the rest of the Trinity's shell, the buttons are decently grippable, which is a welcome change from the slippery shell buttons we saw in the Stormbreakers. But despite the shell shape here on the Trinity, unfortunately the design of the main clicks repeats 2 critical issues that we've seen PWNAGE have on their previous mice. Firstly, the main clicks aren't very well stabilized. Now, to be clear, they're not nearly as bad as the Stormbreaker V1's main clicks, but the clicks do shift a lot more than I'd like to see, which does make them feel a little cheap. This is primarily due to the new anchoring mechanism PWNAGE is using for the main clicks here, as instead of being anchored towards the middle of the shell like most traditional symmetrical mice, the clicks are anchored into the shell much more towards the rear of the mouse, and they have a much longer stem to them, which is why the clicks don't feel as well tensioned as the clicks on other symmetrical mice that use a more standard anchoring mechanism. The second issue is that the main clicks are still not indented into the shell. Now, on the Stormbreakers, this wasn't as big of an issue, as the mouse's sides and click height were much higher, so interference issues were rare, but on the much smaller and lower click height Trinity, these non-indented clicks have a lot of issues with interference, specifically towards the very front of the shell's sides. Now, thankfully, the gap between the shell sides and the clicks is pretty thin, so interference aren't as bad as they would be on a mouse with wider gaps, but if you rest your thumb or your pinky and ring finger towards the front of the mouse's shell, you'll probably notice that the clicks will sometimes feel a little weird in terms of actuation weight, as your fingers are interfering with the click's natural actuation. Now, in terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test for the Trinity's main clicks. As you can probably tell from the sound test, just like the previous Ponage mice, the Trinity is using the same mel0n optical switches we've seen used on the Stormbreakers. These switches are also binned to ensure they perform and feel consistent, and they're rated for 7 million plus actuations. Now in terms of click feel, the main clicks have a similar actuation weight to the BLG Stormbreaker, feeling around a 6 out of 10, but it's worth noting that the actuation weight will change depending on where you click, feeling the lightest towards the end of the click and the highest at the top. This is again due to Ponage's new anchoring mechanism for the main clicks, as they're anchored much farther back in the shell than the main clicks are on more traditional symmetrical mice. So not only is this new anchoring mechanism causing the main clicks to feel a little less tension than I like to see, this is also causing the difference you'll feel from clicking the front to the end of the clicks and their actuation weight to be a little more pronounced than we see on traditional symmetrical mice that are using more normal anchoring mechanisms for their main clicks. In terms of pre and post travel, both the Trinity's main clicks have a low range of pre-travel and a medium range of post-travel. The clicks do also have a decent rebound, but again due to the unique anchoring, it's weaker than the rebound of the Stormbreaker's main clicks, so the buttons feel semi-spammable, but not nearly as crispy and responsive as you'd expect. But on the plus side, due to the binned nature of the mel0n optical switches, both the main clicks are consistent in terms of their pre and post travel, of course once they're fixed, and the actuation weights are consistent as long as you click in the same spot on both the clicks. But overall, the Trinity's main clicks feel okay, but they definitely don't feel as good as the Stormbreaker's main clicks in my opinion. And also, if you do experience any inconsistencies with the main clicks in terms of slam clicking or unintentional actuations, make sure your Trinity is up to date. As I mentioned earlier, I did have some double clicking issues on my Trinity out of the box, but a firmware update fixed this, and with the more recent firmware updates, they also added a slam click filter to help deter any additional issues. So if you are experiencing any issues with your Trinity, make sure to update the firmware to the latest version and enable this slam click filter if needed. Alright, next let's talk side buttons. Now just like the main clicks, the Trinity side buttons are quite different from the other side buttons we've seen on Ponage's other mice. Now before I talk about these more, I wanted to quickly reiterate that out of the box my side buttons felt quite bad due to the PCB being loose, but once I re-anchored the PCB properly, the side buttons felt significantly better. Now compared to the Stormbreaker's side buttons, the Trinity side buttons have been shrunk down significantly and their angling has been also changed. They're a little flatter, but they still have a slight curvature to them, but it's much less aggressive than the side buttons we saw on the Stormbreakers. Now the side buttons themselves are a flattened design which I quite like, and they do share the same matte coating as the rest of the shell, so despite their smaller size they're decently grippy, and their positioning is quite good too, being positioned slightly forward of the mouse's midline, but they're positioned quite high in the mouse's side frame, which is fine on paper, but sadly the Trinity side buttons aren't very pronounced, much less so than the Stormbreaker's side buttons, so while their shape and positioning is good, they're a little flat feeling, still usable by all means, but I do wish that they were a little more pronounced so they'd be slightly easier to actuate. But sadly, again, just like the main clicks, I did need to fix the side buttons too, as I mentioned earlier, but even with the PCB properly anchored, sadly the Trinity side buttons do have quite poor stabilization, as the buttons themselves have a lot of wobbling to them, and depending on where you actuate them, you'll feel the button tilt quite a bit. But on the plus side, the actuation weight of the side buttons is much lighter than the Stormbreakers, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. In terms of click audio, here's a quick sound test of the Trinity side buttons for you. Inside, the Trinity is using the mel0n black shell blue dot micro switches, the same switches we found inside the Stormbreakers, but as I just mentioned, despite them using the same switch, the Trinity side buttons are much lighter than the Stormbreakers, feeling roughly the same as the main clicks in terms of actuation weight, being around a 6 out of 10. Both of the side buttons have a very low range of pre-travel and a low range of post-travel as well, and they do have a nice snappy rebound to them, one that's much better than the main clicks, and combined with their low ranges of pre and post-travel, the side buttons do feel fairly spammable, but again, the buttons themselves do wobble a lot and they're not very pronounced from the side shell, so they are a little difficult to actuate. So sadly, despite the lower actuation weights, the side buttons here on the Trinity do feel like a downgrade compared to the ones on the Stormbreaker, as while the Stormbreaker's side buttons were heavier, they were much more consistent in terms of their feeling compared to the Trinity's side buttons. Now, while many aspects of the Trinity have changed significantly from Ponage's other mice, one thing that hasn't changed is the scroll wheel, which is a good thing in my opinion, as I personally quite like Ponage's scroll wheels. Now, the scroll wheel isn't rubberized like many other scroll wheels are, instead it's a plastic wheel with a crescent-like texturing to it. Now, normally I'd be concerned about the wheel feeling slippery, but the texturing is actually quite pronounced, so the Trinity scroll wheel is very easy to grip and scroll, and the scroll wheel itself is decently pronounced from the top shell too, and there's going to be no effect to your range of scroll on the Trinity Trinity scroll wheel. On the inside, the Trinity is using a TTC 11mm scroll wheel encoder, a slightly weaker encoder compared to the 13mm encoders we saw in the previous Stormbreakers, and as expected due to the slight difference between these encoders, the scroll force of the Trinity scroll wheel is slightly weaker than it was on the Stormbreakers, having an actuation weight of around 5 out of 10 with semi-pronounced scroll points. Now these scroll points are weaker than the ones on the Stormbreakers scroll wheels, but the ones here on the Trinity are pronounced enough to keep the scroll wheel controllable and prevent any accidental scrolling when scroll wheel clicking the Trinity scroll wheel. Speaking of the scroll wheel click, inside the Trinity is using the same pillar switch design we've seen used on the Stormbreakers and almost every other ultralight mouse on the market. Now I assume this switch is either a TTC or a Kale switch, but sadly I wasn't able to ID it since it has no visible markers on it, but despite its unknown manufacturer, it has the same expected specs for a pillar switch as its actuation weight is on the heavier side, feeling around a 7 out of 10, and due to its nature it has a pretty weak rebound, feeling similar to the main clicks in terms of its rebound strength. Now before we talk about the Trinity sensor and MCU, I wanted to quickly go over the Trinity supported connectivity types. Unsurprisingly, just like all the previous PWNAGE mice, the Trinity only supports 2.4 GHz wireless and wired USB-C connectivity types. There is no Bluetooth connectivity here, which in all honesty is fine, as Bluetooth is kind of a pointless feature on a gaming optimized mouse in my opinion. Now in terms of sensor and MCU, unlike the Stormbreaker V1 and the BLG Stormbreaker I reviewed before, the Trinity is using PWNAGE's new X0 sensor, which just like every other custom-in sensor we've seen used lately is just a renamed PA3950. However, this sensor has been slightly modified to have a max DPI of 36,000, 4,000 DPI higher than the stock 3950's DPI of 32,000. The sensor also has the same 50 gram acceleration 750 IPS rating as all other 3950s, though there have been no other modification to this sensor in terms of its actual specs. The sensor also supports the expected 3 LOD levels, 0.7mm, 1mm, and 2mm. It also supports motion sync, but ripple and angle snapping seem to be disabled as there's no option to enable it in the Trinity software. But sadly, even though the mouse is using a 3950, the Trinity doesn't support any sensor tilting, which is disappointing considering the sensor's adjustable nature. I hope we see PWNAGE enable this feature in the future, as it's a very useful feature for people like myself who use angled grips, and of course it makes the Trinity's performance even more customizable. And lastly, in terms of MCU, as expected, the Trinity is using the Nordic 52840, the tried and true MCU we saw used on the Stormbreakers and almost every other high performance gaming mouse on the market. In terms of high polling rates, just like the BLG Stormbreaker, the Trinity supports 8K polling on both the 2.4 GHz and wired USB-C connectivity types. And just like we've seen on PWNAGE's previous releases, the 1, 2, and 4K polling rates on both connectivity modes were extremely well implemented, and I didn't run into any issues with them over my testing. Sadly, I wasn't able to test the 8K polling rate due to the age of my system, but the other report rates were perfectly implemented as expected for a PWNAGE mouse. In terms of battery, the Trinity is using the same 300 mAh battery we saw PWNAGE use for the Stormbreakers. Now admittedly, I am surprised not to see a lighter, smaller capacity 250 mAh battery, as that's kind of the standard for ultralight mice like the Trinity, but a 300 mAh battery is by all means completely fine, just a little heavier. Now according to PWNAGE's marketing, they're advertising that the Trinity will last around 160 hours when used for general use and 100 hours for gaming, but as usual they don't specify what report rate was used to get this data or what the mouse's auto sleep timer was set to, so just like we saw with the previous PWNAGE releases, the Trinity's actual battery life is quite different from these advertised values. Now testing my Trinity on all of its various report rates with the auto sleep set to 10 hours and the mouse left on a jiggler which was set to constant motion, on 1K Hz the Trinity lasted around 105 hours, on 2K Hz it lasted around 74 hours, on 4K Hz it lasted around 69 hours, and on 4K Hz it lasted approximately 55 hours. But keep in mind that this battery life data was based off of constant motion and with the auto sleep disabled. In general day-to-day use, the mouse won't be constantly moving and the mouse's auto sleep will kick in to save additional battery life, so the actual battery life of the Trinity will be a little longer than what's listed here. But while the battery life here on the Trinity is quite good, the only real complaint I have about it, as I mentioned earlier, is that PWNAGE still hasn't blacked out the battery's cables, which is very disappointing, as the colored cables do stand out from the mouse's top shell like a sore thumb. But on the plus side, the USB-C port for the Trinity is fully universal and is usable with all types of aftermarket cables, and the internal battery is actually very easy to access since the Trinity is so serviceable. So if you wanted to mod the heavier battery out for a lighter 200 or 250 mAh battery, you can do so quite easily, but keep in mind this will significantly affect the mouse's battery life. Also, one thing about the battery I forgot to mention earlier is that the battery's base adhesive is actually exposed through the base of the shell, which is unfortunate to see. So over time this base adhesive will pick up dirt and debris from your mouse pad, and it would have been nice to see the Trinity have a more solid base in this area so this wouldn't pick up dirt and grime over time. Hopefully this is something we'll see patched on the next version of the Trinity. Next, let's talk about the Trinity software. Now, PWNAGE has done away with their local software as all of their products released after the Stormbreaker V2 now support their web-based software called the PWNAGE Hub. Now, I already talked about this software before when I covered the BLG Stormbreaker, but there have been some pretty significant improvements to this software since I last used it. Now, as usual for all web-based softwares, the PWNAGE Hub only supports Chromium-based browsers such as Chrome, Chromium, and Edge, and it does not support browsers such as Firefox, so keep that in mind. Now, to connect your device to the PWNAGE Hub software, simply go to the software's URL, which I'll have linked down in the video description, and select your device and then select it again from this drop-down window and you'll load into the software. Now inside the software on the main tab here, you can select the profiles you'd like to use for the mouse. The Trinity supports up to 3 separate profiles, and you can also adjust the polling rates and auto sleep timer as well at the bottom here, and you can also see the mouse's battery level or charging status as well. And next to the battery bar, you can also click either this DPI or report rate button to quickly cycle those settings instead of manually configuring them. In the next tab, the DPI tab, you can adjust the mouse's DPI levels manually. The mouse does support 5 separate DPI layers per profile. You can also enable the slam click filter I mentioned earlier, and you can enable or disable motion sync and pick the mouse's LOD levels. You can also adjust the mouse's lighting, but for some reason it doesn't seem to be working on my Trinity, but I assume this will be fixed with a future firmware update. In the next tab, we have the new button mapping tab, which is currently in beta. Here you can reconfigure the mouse's buttons to different assignments, and this also includes a rebind option to cycle the mouse's profiles via one of the buttons, which is a great attention to detail. Currently there isn't a macro editor for the Trinity, but I assume this will be coming soon, and I also assume that PWNAGE will add a rebind option to activate the macros to various buttons when this editor is added. And lastly, up at the top right we have an update button in which you can update the firmwares for the mouse and the dongles of all of PWNAGE's supported products directly through the web-based software, and the update process is actually pretty simple and very well explained, which is great to see. The only nitpick I have about the current PWNAGE Hub software is I wish there was a way to alter the sleep behavior of the mice, as currently when the Trinity falls asleep, the only way to wake it up is to click a button. Moving the mouse won't do anything, which isn't my preferred wake up style for auto sleep, so I'd love to see PWNAGE have an option to pick what kind of auto sleep behavior you'd like to have, but this is a very minimal nitpick, and overall the PWNAGE Hub experience is fantastic. Definitely one of the best web-based drivers available on the market right now, and it seems to be improving more and more as PWNAGE puts more features in here, which is a great thing to see. And in terms of repairability, just as we've seen with PWNAGE's previous releases, the Trinity is a fairly serviceable mouse, which is a very good thing considering the QC issues I had with my unit out of the box. Now of course, hopefully the final retail Trinities won't have any issues, but considering its open shell design, if you need to open the unit to clean it or swap components or mod something such as the battery, it's very easy to do so. Now if you'd like to learn how to fully disassemble and reassemble the Trinity, or just see how the mouse is built on the inside, or see how the adjustable sensor works, be sure to get subscribed so you don't miss the Trinity's full teardown guide, which will be coming out in a couple days. And in terms of stock skates, as I mentioned earlier, the Trinity comes with a full-size set of PTFE skates pre-installed, and it also includes an additional set of full-size skates and a set of 40 dot skates. Now all of these skates will have the blue protective film over them, so be sure to remove this film before you use any of the skates. Now the stock skates themselves are a smaller surface area design, similar to the ones we saw in the Stormbreaker lineup, being more akin to the design of speed stocks. The dot skates are also quite unique as they're larger than the traditional 6.5mm dots we commonly see, measuring around 7.5mm wide. Now both of these skate types are 100% PTFE and they all have rounded edges, and both types do perform quite well. Sadly, there are still no skate removal ramps on the bottom of the mouse, which is something I've been wanting PWNAGE to add to their mice for a while now, so you'll need to use a removal tool or a flathead screwdriver to remove the Trinity's stock skates if you want to use aftermarket skates, but be very careful if you do end up using a flathead screwdriver to do this, as the base of the Trinity shell is very easy to scratch and damage. But one interesting notable change change to the Trinity is that the mouse's base is completely flat, with divots cut around the skate install areas, unlike the base of Stormbreakers, which had raised areas around their skates. Now, I actually quite like this change as it gives way more flexibility for skate installations, specifically with dot skates or aftermarket skate types, but again, since the base shell is so thin and since it bends and warps so easily, I'd avoid putting any skates around the sensor region, as the skate could cause the sensor to tilt or bend during use. But overall, the stock skates here for the Trinity are quite good, and I'm very happy to see that the mouse's base is completely flat, as it makes the Trinity much more compatible with aftermarket skates, much more so than Ponage's previous mice have been. And lastly, let's talk about the Trinity stock cable. As I mentioned earlier, the stock cable is a standard USB A to C cable with a fairly smooth paracord wrapping, but sadly the cable has been made thicker than the one we saw included with the BLG Stormbreaker. So the Trinity's cable is much more rigid, and sadly it also still doesn't have a tilted USB-C end. Now, to be clear, despite the extra thinness, the cable is still fully usable for wired use and actually feels quite good, unlike most mice's stock cables, and it is still fully compatible with bungees such as the Pulsar ES bungee, but I am sad they made the cable thicker, as the BLG Stormbreaker cable was pretty much perfect in my opinion, aside for its non-tilted USB-C end, but at the end of the day this difference is pretty minimal. But the Trinity stock cable still feels great and still feels pretty good compared to the BLG Stormbreaker cable. The only thing I'd like to see change about it is I would love to see it have a tilted USB-C end, just like Pulsar stock cables. Alright, well, in closing, overall the Ponage Trinity is again a step in the right direction for Ponage, and for this being their first carbon fiber mouse, it is decently good. But sadly, the Trinity repeats many of the same mistakes Ponage has made with their previous releases and makes some new ones. And the thing that really confuses me here with the Trinity is that this could have been an incredible mouse, but I get the feeling that this mouse was rushed, as many of the mistakes here with this mouse seem to be oversights from a rushed release. I think with more R&D time and some adjustments to the mouse design, the Trinity could be a very solid release, one that would easily be one of the best carbon fiber mice available on the market, but in its current iteration there are just too many issues for me to recommend this mouse, which really kills me, as I genuinely really like Ponage's products. Their adjustable sensor tech and how they keep pushing the envelope with their designs always really impresses me, but every single one of their mice have always had some kind of critical QC or build quality flaw that heavily hampers the overall experience. And I was really hoping that the Trinity wasn't going to fall into the same pattern, but sadly here we are yet again with another Ponage release that repeats many of the same mistakes of their prior versions, as well as makes a bunch of new critical mistakes that heavily hampers the overall usage of the mouse, which is really disappointing. But that said, I remain hopeful for Ponage, as they have so much potential, and I am excited to see what they do with the Trinity V2 and their other future mice, and hopefully those mice end up being much more solid with better QC and better designs, but we'll have to wait and see what Ponage is cooking up behind the scenes. But if you'd like to learn more about the Ponage Trinity, you can check out the mouse's product page down in the video description. With that, that's everything for today's episode of the mel0n Review. Thank you very much to all of our channel members who make what I do here on the channel possible. If you didn't know, channel members get exclusive early access to all upcoming content here on the channel, so if you'd like to see new episodes of the mel0n Review or Teardown before anyone else, and of course support the channel, you can become a member here on YouTube for only $2 Canadian a month. You can also support the channel by using code mel0n with a 0 over at Lethal Gaming Gear, Potent Gaming, and Mech Keys to of course save yourself some money off your orders and help directly support the channel. But that's all for my review of the Ponage Trinity. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the mel0n Review. Peace.